noisy. I realized that I'm the last person to bring you at lunch. And what we just learned is that, well, I was going to say, I hope you don't get hypoglycemia, but now you might lose some weight and regain it all at lunchtime. So stick with the problem. So this is a fairly large topic with many cardiovascular outcome trials. I'm going to give you just a summary of many of them, and I hope you forgive me for doing that in the interest of time, but I'll be happy to take questions later on. We know that diabetes is associated with a wide range of cardiovascular diseases, and what is really interesting is that there are multiple studies showing a very clear linear relationship between glucose and cardiovascular events. It's a little better for postprandial glucose than fasting glucose, but it's a glucose across. In addition, those are factors that's mainly myocardial infarction. On top of it, we have a major emerging problem as we've got better at treating myocardial infarction and putting stents into people with cardiomyopathy and heart failure, which is becoming a very expensive chronic problem. This relates to a number of things that are related to the overall syndrome we're talking about. Hypertension in the background, small vessel disease, advanced glycation end products, some degree of neuropathy and autonomic dysfunction, as well as nephropathy. In the background, we have adipose tissue, which, as you heard, secretes a number of inflammatory factors like TNF-alpha, IL-1, IL-6, etc., and as well as angiotensin, angiotensinogen, and things that interfere with coagulation, clot breakdown like PI1. So all these constellation of risk factors and risks in our patient population contribute to this epidemic of cardiovascular disease, and then its progression on to heart failure and death. So as I turn to the trials, I want to point out one or two things that are very important as we look at this wide range of trials. And that is the variety of patients that are included in these trials, and the results, the design of these trials, and the results depend on the patient population that you have included in there. And one way to look at it is the event rates in these trials. If you see the difference in annual event rates, whether it's in the overall group or the placebo group, it's really quite different. And so what you have is extremely high-risk patients and in some trials, and less high-risk patients in the other trials. When you're looking at trials between, even using drugs for the same class, for example, between the Elixir trial and the leader trial, as we were discussing this morning, you shouldn't make direct comparisons because the nature of the population is very different. Some have much higher risk. Now, when you take high-risk patients, if you're successful, you may have a tremendous degree of success. At the same time, you also have a lot of risk that these people will get high event rates, even in the treatment group, and so you may have problems. And if you have people who have very low rates of events, you have to study them for a long period of time in order to have sufficient number of events to see the benefits of treatment. You also have the risk of certain things going wrong that are off-target, completely unrelated to cardiovascular disease. And we come to realize that type 2 diabetes is not a uniform cardiovascular risk equivalent. It's dependent on the duration of this diabetes, the age of the patient, the presence of other complications such as nephropathy and chronic kidney disease and autonomic neuropathy, and all these influence the outcomes. The risk varies and is determined by the various risk factors. So if you look at the risk of heart failure and myocardial infarction in various trials, this is in a way a repeat of the previous study, but it also includes heart failure. And there's a very wide variation between the rates that have occurred in some studies that vary to be with extremely high-risk population who were post-intervention, to studies like UKPDS, which were newly diagnosed diabetes. So there's you have to keep that in mind when you're interpreting results. And this is a summary of glucose lowering. This is not drug-related, this is just glucose lowering in general. And one important aspect is that all of them show that glucose lowering reduced microvascular disease. However, when you start looking into cardiovascular disease, you have some different results from different Some of them, like UKPDS, over a long period of time, showed a reduction in CVD and mortality, but not over even 8-9 years of the UKPDS. It took much longer. Accord raised a very red flag, a big problem of the aim for normal glycemia and got an increase in cardiovascular events. And the simplistic view was glucose is not so important, it's all about blood pressure and lipids. But let me remind you that the lipid lowering arm also did not have a benefit in outcomes, and the same applied to blood pressure. So maybe the Accord population was different, and I'll address that in a little bit more detail. So here is UKPDS, and although this shows that this is the myocardial infarction, and then in the metformin group, this is the first real single drug treatment that reduced cardiovascular events. Although I want to remind you that the number of people studied in UKPDS with obesity and treated with metformin was relatively small. Even so, this has established metformin as a first-line therapy. Now, the Accord trial, as I pointed out, I was being an investigator in Accord, had this real problem of how to interpret getting the glucose to near normal and having an increase in mortality. So one of the important points to recognize with the Accord is that people who got low A1C did not always have, they did not necessarily have the higher mortality. In fact, it was the people who had high A1Cs, A1C of about 8, who struggled to lower their A1C, who had a greater event rate and increased mortality. It was those who failed to reduce the A1C sufficiently at the end of 1 year who had the problem. Even so, the Accord trial led us to relax some of our goals in diabetes and to individualize treatment so that we don't let our patients get into trouble. We've been looking at other reasons why we had a result in Accord, and one of them, that probably the best predictor of outcomes in Accord and many other studies, is actually autonomic neuropathy. And a very simple testing, you don't need complex testing, and I'm glad you're interested in Jerry Raymond's view on this. Just the loss of RR variation on a simple rhythm strip can predict outcomes. We were looking at another factor, which is A1C and its relationship with mean blood glucose. And we often look at it and think that it's a linear relationship, but some people have a higher A1C than what you would expect from the glucose, and we consider them to be high glycators, and others have a lower glycators. And we've come up with equations to predict the relationship between A1C and glucose in a population, and we've come up with the concept of high glycation index, and what we see is that there are people who, let me show you the next slide, which sums it up. Those who have a higher A1C than you would predict from their glucose have the highest rates of hypoglycemia and the highest mortality. And we think that this is related in many ways to tissue glycation, leading to problems, and also over-aggressive treatment in people who, based on A1C, whose glucose may be lower and they get hypoglycemia because you're too aggressive in treatment. What we are now looking at genetic studies. We think this is inherited. We know that African Americans, for example, have a higher A1C for a given level of mean blood glucose. And this is something that you may want to study in an Indian population because there's no data on that. And anemia is a common problem, and you may have A1Cs that are discrepant from glucose in your population. So we know now that here are the predictors in the Accord study of hypoglycemia and events. African Americans, it was much higher. Those with renal disease, to some degree, women. And this was probably the only protective thing was higher BMI because these people got less hypoglycemia. And this is just a summary slide from a review article we published in Diabetes Care a few years ago, looking at the impact of hypoglycemia, leading to endothelial dysfunction, rhythm abnormalities, coagulation abnormalities, and inflammation. So it's not just hypoglycemia and obesity that triggers some of these abnormalities. Over-aggressive treatment can also do so. So we need to be very careful about how we approach people. And here's one of our studies in the EA population, showing that people who get hypoglycemia have more events over the subsequent 3 years. So, with that background, let's look at cardiovascular outcome trials using monotherapies, and very often the control group is a placebo, and that's really to study the drug's drug effect itself. And I told you the first study was metformin, and then the second study, which we had great hopes, was the proactive study with pioglitazone. And what this study showed was a reduction in the primary endpoint, which was an unfortunate composite beyond cardiovascular disease, and it was reduced to only 10%, which was somewhat disappointing. But if you look at the main secondary endpoint, which is what we currently define as major adverse cardiovascular events, that was reduced by 16%, which was statistically significant. And in particular interest was the reduction in stroke within that group of components of the secondary endpoint. So, to build on this further, NIH did a study called IRIS, which they took people with insulin resistance and a prior stroke and randomized them to receive pioglitazone or placebo, and yielded pioglitazone reduced the event rate by almost 25%. So a very good outcome in a population selected to have a good outcome because of what we learned from prior trials. And we need to bear this in mind in relation to some of the other things that have happened with pioglitazone. Along with what happened with pioglitazone, as you know, is the history of rosiglitazone, that we were scared that this was a very cardiovascularly toxic drug, and the FDA came out with the mandate that every new drug for diabetes should be proven to be safe from a cardiovascular perspective. This is why we now have this plethora of cardiovascular outcome trials. Now, when you do 20 trials, just by chance alone, one of them is going to give you a result that you didn't expect. But these trials were designed to demonstrate safety. We are now moving towards designing trials for benefit. But even within these safety trials, we have some very interesting results which I will now discuss. And the FDA mandate was to show that you did not do harm, and it had to have an effect for a confidence interval that did not increase 1.8 at the time of approval, and on completion of the cardiovascular outcome trial, it should be below 1.3, otherwise you have to take the drug off the market. So as a result, every new class of diabetes agent has had to be tested for cardiovascular outcomes. And this has led to a lot of confusion. People think that some of these trials were done to show cardiovascular benefit. That is actually not true. I've heard several cardiologists tell me after the DPP-4 trials, well, isn't it disappointing? These drugs are not showing a benefit. They were not designed to. They were designed to show safety. And indeed, all the studies so far, 3 of them were completed, have demonstrated general safety of DPP-4 inhibitors in terms of myocardial function. I'll come to some of the issues with heart failure and more. There are 2 that are ongoing, and one of them is very interesting because it compares the DPP-4 inhibitor with a sulfonylurea, which has been implicated in cardiovascular events in some very poorly done previous studies. So this is a true comparative effectiveness study, and we'll see what the outcome shows in a little while. We have results from some GLP-1 receptor agonist studies. Some are ongoing, and we should have results in the next couple of years. And we have results from 2 SGLT2 inhibitor trials. Each of these has a large number of patients. There's one good thing that has come out of this. We have studied over 100,000 patients for over 3 years, sometimes going up to 5 years, to see what happens to them. And we've got a wealth of information that we will keep looking at in order to look for signals of other things other than cardiovascular events, but also look for cardiovascular benefits. So just to remind you of something that I mentioned earlier, that the populations are not very different, are very different in these studies, and you should make comparisons. And here is an example of this. 2 of the trials took patients within a few days of acute coronary syndromes, examine and elixir. In contrast, the leader trial took people who had very stable disease. Some of the DPP-4 inhibitor trials to people who are poorly controlled, TCOS to people who are A1C at baseline below 8. And so you're going to get very different results just by the fact that they had different selection criteria. Now, there's not enough space on the slide to put all these trials up, so I'm just showing you that there are differences in these trials that matter. But the endpoint is more or less the same. All of them use what is now a standard endpoint, and some of them added on hospitalization for unstable angina, but otherwise, MACE is the major endpoint. And that's a good thing because that has been standardized and is adjudicated. And the standardized, we had done that with proactive pioglitazone that we recognized a long time ago. So, two of these trials showed safety, which they were designed to do. They were high-risk patients and of much shorter duration. Look at the difference in duration of the trials. Some of them only 2 years or less than 2 years. The leader trial was much longer and had a benefit in terms of this MACE endpoint, and so did Sustain 6, but Sustain 6 was a shorter duration trial, and the benefit was mainly in stroke, and the event rate is much lower. So we're going to need more data on semaglutide, and those trials are currently ongoing. So, one of the things that has emerged in these trials, and that this actually came from the first DPP-4 inhibitor trial, was that there was an increase in heart failure. This was a bit of a surprise. The drug was designed to show, the study was designed to show safety for cardiovascular events, and in fact there is no increase in stroke, death, or myocardial infarction, but a secondary endpoint was hospitalization for heart failure, and there was an increase. This led to a lot of concern about the class, and I'll discuss this in a little more detail. No such effect was seen with sitagliptin, algorithm, and we have not seen this with the GLP-1 receptor agonists. Sub-analysis of these trials have been done, and with sitagliptin in particular, because of that finding, and it was seen that most of the hospitalization for heart failure occurred in people who had a high BNP level at baseline. So essentially, these were people who had unrecognized or sometimes recognized heart failure, and it just got worse. So there was some consideration of the fact that maybe DPP-4 is involved in the breakdown of BNP, and that might be a mechanism. However, they did not do follow-up measurements in the safety trials, so we don't know what happened. But in the examine trial, it was done, and BNP levels were very high at the start because they were post-acute coronary syndrome patients, and the levels did drop both in the placebo group as well as the treatment group. So that's not the mechanism for any heart failure that could occur. And in fact, the general consensus now is that if there is any heart failure increase, it's very small, and in people who were a prior predisposition to get it. These trials also gave us the opportunity to dispel myths about other side effects. So, for example, there was controversy about pancreatitis with the DPP-4 inhibitors. And if you look at the three trials together, you find that there is no increase in pancreatitis. There is this very small numerical increase, but a meta-analysis shows that it is not very large. There's also interest in the microvascular complications. So, nephropathy has been looked at with the liraglutide, and there's a small reduction, small increase in retinopathy. The increase was seen more in the Sustain 6 trial, and this has been looked at in greater detail in future trials in this class. Overall, microvascular events were lower with the liraglutide, and we will be watching that with a lot of interest as we look at some of the SGLT2 inhibitors as well, which show a similar benefit, mainly in reduction of proteinuria and not with hard renal outcomes. And those studies on effects on end-stage renal disease are actually being started up right now. So here's a summary of the leader trials showing that cardiovascular death was reduced, and all-cause mortality was also reduced. And last week, the FDA gave approval for a change in the label for liraglutide in terms of reducing cardiovascular events and cardiovascular events. So this was very similar to the label information given in the impact influenza. Of course, the big result that got a lot of people's attention was with impact influenza. You've seen this at this meeting, and we'll have more discussion about it over the next couple of days. So just to summarize, the study was again done for safety, but there was a benefit seen of the primary outcome, which was reduced significantly. But when you pool both groups of doses together, so the effect of myocardial infarction and stroke is actually quite small. The striking effect that has been seen in this study is on mortality, particularly cardiovascular mortality, and on heart failure. And here there's what is very striking is that the effect is almost immediate. So as soon as people go on this drug as compared to placebo, there's a reduction in the risk of hospitalization for heart failure. Many questions as what the mechanism, we don't fully understand it. Here's the summary of the data on the incorrect cardiovascular hospitalization for heart failure in people with prior heart failure or no prior heart failure. It doesn't seem to make a difference. So clearly a very striking effect on this hospitalization. Now this is getting stimulating a lot of interest in heart failure in diabetes, a very common clinical problem, often unrecognized, and interest in what is the role of diabetes drugs in heart failure. And in terms of, we know that the metformin and thiazolidine downs have had some reports of problems with exacerbation of heart failure, particularly with the DCDs. I mentioned also about saxagliptin. And now it turns out that many SGLT2 inhibitors may be the drug of choice for people who have heart failure. But we don't really know what the effect is in people who have the most common form of heart failure in diabetes, which is those with preserved ejection fraction. And this is something that is being studied in more detail. How do we recognize these people better? They tend to have obesity, they tend to have, they're unable, many of them don't exercise, but the question is, are they unable to exercise? And we should be addressing these a little bit more carefully. A number of studies have been initiated, a number of hypotheses about how do the SGLT2 inhibitors reduce this progression of heart failure. One of the theories is that you increase ketone production, and the heart utilizes these ketones preferentially, and it takes less work to use ketones than to use glucose as a fuel. This is still a hypothesis, it's been worked out. We are very interested in the effect of SGLT2 inhibitors on the renin-angiotensin system, particularly on urine-angiotensin. We have an active study that's going on with some impressive preliminary data, and I hope to give you further results in due course. So a number of possible mechanisms that I don't have time to go into. Does it have an effect on left ventricular mass and ejection fraction? And here is one study showing that an index of diastolic dysfunction actually improves, and left ventricular mass index declines with impact influenza treatment. Another interesting twist to all this is a drug that's currently being used for heart failure, sacubitril in combination with valsartan, has been shown to lower hemoglobin A1C to a greater degree than valsartan. We know that ARBs lower A1C a little bit. This combination lowered it to a greater extent, and we just about to start a trial in patients with heart failure who are receiving this type of therapy, and they have coincident with diabetes to see the impact on glucose control. So this was compared to enalapril, sacubitril valsartan led to less initiation of insulin with better glycemic control. I mentioned the microvascular complications being reduced with liraglutide. There's the data of nephropathy in the EMPA-REG outcome trial. A significant reduction compared to placebo, but much of this is driven by reduction in albuminuria. You would expect reduction in albuminuria when you lower the peak blood pressure, as we'll see in this trial. So we need to do further studies to determine whether there's a true effect of SGLT2 inhibition on the kidney We think that there are a number of theoretical reasons why that may be the case, and it is undergoing not only intensive investigation of the mechanism, but renal studies, renal outcome studies have been initiated. This is beyond just the cardiovascular outcome studies, and we will see whether we can reduce the need for dialysis and transplantation in these patients. So I just put this slide, I just got on it last week with the Canvas trial. You can see a better version of the slide as well at this meeting. Very similar results in terms of heart failure with the Canvas study compared to very similar to what you saw with EMPA-REG. There's one difference in that there was no reduction in cardiovascular mortality. Now it may be that, as we discussed this morning, there was a number of patients who did not have a prior myocardial infarction or cardiovascular event in the Canvas study. So this primary prevention, as opposed to EMPA-REG, where 99% of patients had no cardiovascular disease, so essentially secondary prevention. And we know that you always get better results with secondary prevention as compared to primary prevention. And there's one further study called DECLARE that is going to be done and ongoing with a much greater proportion of patients where primary prevention is what we're looking at. So you need a larger study and a longer duration, and that's why we don't have results yet with the Magniflotin. And it'll be very interesting if these drugs work for primary prevention of cardiovascular events and decrease mortality, because that will move them up in the treatment algorithm to be drugs of choice for treating patients after metformin has failed, something we're going to debate later on today. So what else can we do in patients with diabetes? And yesterday we discussed about statins that lower cardiovascular risk very significantly, often by 30–40%. Well, what that means is we still have a way to go. And the term we use for that is residual risk. And we still need to prevent these people from progressing. And we haven't reduced LDL sufficiently in many of them. As we discussed yesterday, what do? Fibrates don't work, niacin doesn't work as in PMI. Bile-acid sequestrants, there's no data. Ezetimibe and PCSK9, we talked about very briefly yesterday, so I'll just point out to you the results of the IMPROVE-IT study, which showed a small additional reduction in LDL cholesterol beyond statin therapy led to a significant reduction in cardiovascular events. Much of this was seen in the diabetes population. So here's the breakdown in people with diabetes having the greatest reduction in events by dropping their LDL from 70 to 53. We now have PCSK9 inhibitors that have the potential to lower the LDL much greater than we could lower with this combination of statins and ezetimibe. And we have results from one of those trials, the Ivolumab study, showing further reduction in LDL cholesterol that was possible with ezetimibe and a greater reduction in cardiovascular events. I want to end by telling you about a new target that we've just started working with. It's actually an old therapy. Many of you may have heard of chelation infusions using EDTA, supposedly to remove calcium and other heavy metals. And a study funded by NIH was done, completed about a year ago. And very often NIH looks at these alternative therapies from the Center of Complementary and Alternative Medicine because they are widely used. It's not covered by insurance, it's got out of favor of it, but it was used many years ago for people with cardiovascular disease. And overall, the net result was no benefit. Particularly in people without diabetes. No benefit at all. But a very striking 40% reduction in event rates in the people in this chelation study with diabetes. Now, of course, this is a subgroup analysis, so what do? You do what happened in the IRIS study. NIH has just started funding TAT2, that's trial to assess chelation therapy number 2, exclusively in people with diabetes. And there's also a 2x2 factorial design also looking at high-dose vitamins, homocysteine, things like that. And we are studying patients who had myocardial infarction and diabetes. And the study just started about 3 months ago. We are looking at other markers within the study to see whether the stimulation changes iron, particularly gadolinium active, ferric form of iron, and also reduces oxidative stress and inflammation. So we hope to complete this study in another 3 to 5 years. It's 1 year of infusions followed by 3 years of follow-up. So what are we going to do next in cardiovascular disease and diabetes? What are the new strategies? Should we have lower goals for the various risk factors? We found it disappointing in the core, but now we can lower them further. We can better target patients, choosing the right therapy, those with heart failure, maybe getting SGLT2 inhibitors, those who have obesity, perhaps getting GLP-1 receptor agonists, people who have a stroke and have features of insulin resistance, maybe treat them with pioglitazone. You heard about treating obesity, perhaps more aggressively now that we have many therapies for that. Should we target inflammation? You heard about that today. So far, there's a modest effect on diabetes. We haven't got a good cardiovascular outcome trial. Or look for new therapeutic targets as we're doing in this case. Thank you very much.